Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to get started because it's 12:30. I hope you're all well. And if you're watching live, I hope you managed to have a restful weekend. So welcome to week 6 of lockdown. I obviously had to count that because time has lost all meaning. My name is Katie Jacobs. I work with HR leaders at the CIPD, and I've been hosting our coronavirus webinar series. This afternoon, we're going to be discussing the importance of leadership and communication in times of crisis. And joining me to discuss this fascinating and really timely topic, I have a great panel of leaders. We've got Peter Cheese, CEO of the CIPD, Dominic Walters, Leadership Communications Consultant and former chairman of the Institute of Internal Communications, Sue Evans, Interim Director of HR and Organisational Change in the public sector, and David Frost, Director of Organisational Development at global food produce business Total Produce. Thank you so much, all of you, for giving up your time to join us today. Now, before we dive into the content, as always, I will just do some quick housekeeping. This session is being recorded. It will be available on demand via the webinar section of the CIPD website. You can also access recordings of our previous webinars there on topics such as wellbeing and furlough, and you can sign up for future sessions. We're running 2 a week at the moment. This Friday, we're going to be looking at how HR teams can look after their own wellbeing, times of immense stress. And then next Monday, we'll be taking a deep dive into supporting line managers. I'll remind you about both of those at the end of the session. Secondly, if you want to submit questions during the webinar, can I ask you to please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat box. We're not monitoring the chat box. And can I also remind you that attendees are all muted? So we've got about 300 of you on, which is brilliant. So any questions need to be submitted via typing. Finally, for legal advice, I'd like to remind CIPD members that you can call our HR Inform helpline. It's available 24/7 and you will get an individual response. And I want to remind you that we're updating the resources on our website all the time. You can head to the CIPD Coronavirus Hub for more. So let's kick off. In times of crisis, the importance of leadership and communication really comes to the fore. And that has never been truer than right now, with leaders needing to communicate clearly, authentically, and empathetically, with teams working remotely and those working hard in the field and on the front line, and often in the same organisation. The uncertainty surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, not knowing when and how lockdown will end, or what this will mean for organisations in the long term, makes things even harder. That's what our speakers are going to unpick today, giving hints, tips, and personal examples of what's worked well for them as leaders and what they've seen work well in organisations. Our running order is as follows. First up, Peter's going to set some context and give some advice for people professionals. Then Dominic's going to offer some practical tips and guidance on getting leadership communication right during times of crisis and uncertainty. Sue will then share her own experience of coming into an HR director role pretty much on day 1 of the pandemic and having to lead a function that she's never met before. David will offer insight into how leaders in his global organisation are communicating across markets and geographies and how HR is helping. And then finally, we'll take questions as a panel. So please do submit them whenever you want during the session via the Q&A box. So that's it from me for now. Sorry about that. I'm going to hand over to Peter to kick off with setting some context. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome everybody to this webinar. An incredibly important theme, as Katie has outlined. I mean, leadership has probably been one of the most studied subjects in business for many decades. I've studied a lot myself, talked a lot about it, and even leading into the crisis, we were talking a lot about leadership in a so-called VUCA world, so volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, with all the changes that are going on around us. And of course, the COVID-19 crisis has accelerated all of that at a breathtaking rate and put us all into a context of which none of us are entirely familiar. So that old refrain that I've heard too much from leaders in the past, where they've often said, well, of course, I've seen it before and this is what happens, cannot be true in these circumstances. So it demands something different from us as leaders right from the beginning. So leadership in a crisis is what this is about. How do I lead through very, very uncertain times when I myself as a leader, or any of us as leaders, can be extremely uncertain of exactly how to respond. And indeed can be very stressed and challenged ourselves with the unfolding of the crisis. So this is without doubt probably the biggest test of leadership that any of us have faced. And when I say leadership, and I think throughout this webinar, we're not just talking about the people at the very top. We all have our roles in organizations as leaders, particularly for our profession as HR people. 2 points are important. The first is that our profession very much is what we've described as on the front line of the organizational response. And we hear it, and you will hear it from 2 HR leaders on this webinar, that we really are right there and needing, of course, to support leaders and managers right across the organization, as well as driving our own teams to enable businesses to operate in very different circumstances. But we've always had a role, I would argue, as a profession in supporting leaders, leadership development, understanding what's good, and encouraging leaders to act in the right ways. And now is the time, therefore, for us as a profession to support leaders everywhere, as well as demonstrating our own leadership capability. I think also that what is always, in my mind, at the very heart of good leadership is the understanding of people. These ideas of compassion and emotional intelligence, and of course, well-being, which is at the very forefront of this crisis. Not just the physical well-being associated with the actual effects of the COVID-19 virus, but all the related mental health issues that are clearly emerging from all of this. And thank goodness, again, we've been talking about many of these things leading into this crisis, but it has again accelerated a lot of the debate about what we have to do and what is our duty of care at all levels of leadership and management, excuse me, all levels of leadership and management in supporting our people properly. I think it's also true that we will be judged during this time of how we make decisions as leaders, perhaps more than we ever have. There are so many different things to weigh out, all the way from the short-term issues and cost expediencies and making sure we can navigate through very, very tough short-term response to the crisis with the lockdowns and the very big shifts to different ways of working, through the medium term where we begin, and we're now seeing, of course, the signs and signals from government, begin to return to some form of workplace working. And then, of course, in the longer term, what this will mean ultimately for us as businesses, us as leaders, what we learn from the crisis that we can take forward in positive ways. So that combination of both short-term, medium-term, and long-term thinking is very challenging. And then being able to think about it systemically, so that we are not just looking at purely financial outcomes, but we're understanding other things, like, of course, all the different options we have in terms of how our organizations react to the current circumstances. What are some of the legal constraints? But perhaps above all, what are the ethical and moral things that we do which demonstrate we're making the right decisions in all these different circumstances, that we're acting according to our principles, that we're acting according to our stated values, which we've all spent a lot of time on in recent years articulating. And interesting, I've always been a bit of a student of values, that integrity is the most commonly stated corporate value. So now is the time when we really, really have to step up and show that what we are doing is acting with integrity. And that integrity means that we are understanding all the different interests and needs of all of our stakeholders. And beginning, of course, with the people that we're responsible to, our employees, but also our customers and our suppliers, the communities of which business is so clearly part of, and so on. And those, this idea of, if you will, multi-stakeholder capitalism is also part of the debate now for leaders. So you've got all those different aspects of how we have to think about leadership in this context. But as I said, driven very much from this idea that we must act according to good principles, to reinforcement of our values, and recognizing that often we're making decisions which aren't always with lots of analysis. We're having to engage people in very, very different ways. So finally, I would say that this is leading, of course, to what should be, and what we've also talked about in leadership for some time, a more humble form of leadership, recognizing that none of us as leaders, whatever level we're at, can know all the answers. We have to be open and engaging others. We have to engage people at all levels as to how we're responding to this, what are the decisions we're making, and how does that best serve the individual and collective interests for all that those we are responsible to. And those are very, very challenging things to put together. And then, of course, finally, is to talk about communications, which we're going to be talking about a bit more, particularly with Dominic. I don't know if you saw it, but Jeff Bezos at Amazon was commenting recently that he has spent more time with his organization and talking to his people than he ever had in pretty much all the time that Amazon's existed. I heard from a CEO just last week saying in the last 8 weeks, they'd spent more time with their head of HR than they had in the previous 8 years. Which probably says as much about what's happened in the recent 8 weeks as what had happened in the previous 8 years. And it is this stuff, therefore, about how we're engaging, connecting, communicating, showing empathy and compassion, but also showing and being honest ourselves as leaders that we can't know it all. We are also vulnerable, and we need to talk about that openly as well as part of our communications. And if we do those things, then we create that culture, that environment where people also can feel that they speak up. And I've experienced all those things myself as a leader at the CIPD, and how I'm communicating very differently and much more frequently. I won't always get it right, and that's true for all of us. But oh my goodness, I think it has really shifted our thinking and understanding of what is important in leadership. And I believe those are things that we need to take forwards beyond the crisis so that we are getting positive outcomes from this terrible time as well. So Katie, on that note, let me hand it back to you, and you can pick up the thread from there.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. Really, really great context. And as somebody who works at the CIPD, I would say you're getting it right most of the time, so don't worry. I'm going to hand over to Dominic Walters now. I'll let Dominic introduce himself, and he's going to take us through some practical tips and guidance for communicating pre-crisis. Thank you.
Katie, thank you very much, and good afternoon. I'm Dominic Walters. I work with organisations and leaders to help them think through how they communicate and connect with their people. So often involved in coaching, training, developing strategies. And so what I'd love to share with you for the next 5-10 minutes is some of the key things that we've experienced working with different organisations, working with leadership teams, some of their challenges. Look at 3 areas. Firstly, some of the key things that leaders have to do differently. Secondly, to go through some practical tips that I've seen leaders and worked with leaders and experienced myself. And then lastly, just some thoughts about how what's happened will affect the way that leaders communicate beyond, if we ever get back to some sort of normality. So if I can go to the next slide, please. We've already heard, I think, from Peter, a number of the things that I'm going to mention now, a number of the themes, but there seem to be 4 big communication crises or challenges, sorry, that the crisis is giving leaders. As Peter said, leaders are very much under the spotlight at the moment. They will be judged on how they behave now. And just as Peter was saying, we're already seeing that leaders are very conscious of the fact that the values they've been espousing for years are really, really going to be tested now to see whether people are actually performing according to what they said they're going to do. And communication is obviously key to all of that. So some of the challenges we're seeing leaders facing are, firstly, how do I respond to stuff that's changing at a pace we've probably never seen before, but knowing that our actions are going to have long-term implications, not only in terms of the health of our business, but how we interact with our teams, the relationship we have with our teams. I guess if you look at the big stage, seeing Boris coming back today, some of the challenges he's facing, again, looking at the papers over the weekend, are how do I make some decisions because people are asking for some very complex answers very quickly, but knowing that he's going to be judged by history, the government's going to be judged by history as to the implications of what those are. On a slightly smaller scale, that's the dilemma being faced by many leaders. I think secondly, leaders know they've got to be visible. They know they've got to be out with their teams are behaving and performing in different ways. How do they do that without overwhelming people? And this is a challenge that not everyone's getting right. At the moment, it's a hard one to get right. How do you make sure you show your teams that you're caring, you're available, without overwhelming them with your presence? And I know, speaking to some team members, they were saying, I can't believe how irritating it is to have my boss appearing in the corner of my living room so frequently. Thirdly, how do you establish this sense of community, which is important, which you obviously haven't got because you're not necessarily in a physical place, or not everyone is, but also helping people to be more self-reliant. How do you give them the confidence and the information to perform, often at home, but also create a sense of community between them and some of their colleagues who may not be working at home, maybe doing their job in a way that they've done before. And lastly, how do you build these bonds when you haven't got that interaction of people meeting each other in the corridors, or meeting together to have a bite to eat or having coffee together? So if we go to the next slide, please. I'd humbly like to present, I think, 7 tips based on experience. The first one you won't be surprised to see is keeping up a pace, a regular pulse of communication. Regularity is very important. People like the certainty of it. In the early days of the lockdown, I was talking to a team member of a client, and she said to me, one of the great things about knowing I've got a regular check-in every day is I never feel that I'm too far away from shore, which I thought was a lovely mental picture, analogy, if you like, that shows how people feel about having regular sessions where they can go and talk with their line manager, their bosses. We also know there's a temptation when things are busy for leaders to communicate only if they have something that they need to say. That doesn't work very well in normal times. It certainly isn't going to work at the moment. And it's important for leaders to understand just having a check-in, even if they've got nothing to say, to give people a chance to raise issues or comment or ask questions is going to be important. Secondly, this may seem obvious, but leaders need to be very open to new channels. And I think crucially, be prepared to get things wrong and adapt. I suspect that everybody on this call has got his or her own favourite story of something that's gone wrong on a conference call, or where technology has let us down and things haven't worked out as we hoped. It happened to me on Friday, for example. And I think one of the things that we found is that leaders need to be prepared to just go with it. If things aren't working, or if their presentation isn't working out, or if they're not getting the responses in the time that they expected from their colleagues, they need to give them a bit of grace. We found that that's becoming more and more important. My wife is a primary school teacher, and this last week she's been struggling, as her colleagues have been, with a Google Classroom, which you may have come across. And the way they're working now is incredibly different from what it was a week ago, because they've tried things out, they've worked with parents, they've had conversations, and they've found new ways of working. And I think leaders need to be much more open to that. Linked with that, leaders need to think about changing their behaviour. New circumstances mean definitely new sets of rules. I've mentioned the fact that some leaders have been tempted to have regular conversations with their team members as they would if they're in the same office. And that doesn't work if you're constantly emailing someone or constantly trying to get people onto a video link. But more importantly, there's some practical things about changing the tone of the way you communicate. Realizing that when you're standing in front of a group of people in a physical room, the way you need to behave is different from when you're talking on a medium like we are at the moment. You haven't got that distance between people. It's much more egalitarian, and therefore you need to be much more informal in the way that you communicate. And again, another leader I spoke to said to me, I was talking to one of my team members recently, he was bouncing his young son on his knee, and it's hard to be corporate in those sort of circumstances. So you need to be able to flex and adapt. But also, just slightly lightheartedly, we've noticed that leaders need to be learning some broadcast techniques. And I say this with hesitation, as everything I'm about to say, I'm sure I'm not actually following. But for example, we found that leaders have been criticised because the way they come across on video is their face takes up the whole of a screen. And we've had feedback from people saying it's like a scene from 1984, having our boss's face projected in such a large way. We've also heard that, and the BBC have been given guidance about this, that leaders need to run conversations over media like we're doing, as if they're hosting a show. So constantly giving a running narrative about what's happening, bringing people in if they're being quiet, making sure they stick to time. So changing their behaviour in those circumstances as well. Fourthly, I suspect we've all found that in the last couple of weeks we've been focused very much on the operational, keeping the business going, or changing things if it's not going to be actually in business for the next few months. Furloughing, I know, has taken up huge amounts of time for many people. And so in those circumstances, we find it very tempting for leaders to forget the bigger picture. But it's now probably as important, if not more important than ever. And as a practical thing, reminding leaders to perhaps just every 2 weeks, take some time out and give their teams the big picture, the context, where the organisation is heading. Remind them about what's special about the organisation. Reminding people about the purpose of the organisation, which may have been slightly obscured by just keeping things ticking over. And it's a great opportunity every now and again to take stock and share some reasons to believe. Give people some good news about the organisation, even if it's only about how the organisation is adapting to some of the terrible things that may be happening within it. Fifth, this seems fairly self-evident. For any leader, conversation is key. But even more so, I think, in the crisis that many people have been facing, is that having those regular conversations to make the connection, just to find out how people are getting on. Building in regular just chat times with teams, and trying also to include people who are working in different types and circumstances is very important. I think also one of the crucial things about conversation is the opportunity, and I think we heard this from Katie earlier, for leaders to show their vulnerability, for leaders to express their frustrations perhaps with some of the circumstances they're facing, share some of the problems they've been experiencing, some of the things they may have got wrong. All these things build vulnerability, or sorry, express vulnerability and help to build trust between leaders and their teams, which means that people are much more encouraged now to share their own frustrations and comments, but will also give dividends when we come back to some sort of new normality, because people remember how they felt, how they were made to feel by the leaders that were running the team when they were going through the problems. Sixth is an opportunity to share stories. And I think stories on a number of levels. I've already mentioned about the importance of organisations sharing best practice, but also sharing success, but allowing people also to share stories about what they've found, what's worked, hacks they may have come across, their experiences, to share some of their personal experiences as well. These help to build a sense of community. And again, they're one of the things that can get very easily lost when leaders are very much focused on getting things sorted in the operational task side of things as well. And my seventh tip would be to make feedback a priority. And I think that's on two levels. We're already finding, I work with an engagement company, we're already finding that people are focusing, organizations are focusing less on engagement now, but much more on well-being. So using the channels that they may have set up, the surveying channels they may have, to do more regular, shorter, more focused surveys on how people are getting on, what they're making of what's happening, how they're feeling about stuff, making people much more aware about their own personal well-being and how they can access support and help to help. And I think that sort of shift has been something quite significant. So having regular, short surveys, conversations, ways in which people can raise issues and think about their personal well-being has been important. Then more broadly, leaders are finding getting feedback on how they're doing even more crucial than it is in normal times, whatever they are. Being able to ask people what's working for them, what's not, making running repairs to the way they're doing things, having the humility, being humble enough, I guess, to ask for support and help from their people as well. So just to bring this all together, if I go to the last slide, please, and then I'll come into land. What does all this mean about the future leadership communication? I think there's going to be less hierarchy. Once you've seen inside someone's house several times, once you've seen him or her playing with their children or ask them to be quiet, you can never go back to the old rigidity that we had before. I think secondly, people are going to be much more expecting informal conversation, because things have been informal now. That's going to happen in the future. Thirdly, technology. It's worked. Organizations, if they had doubts before about agile working and being able to use technology, will have fewer excuses, to put it plainly. And finally, I think because we've been away from real face-to-face communication for so long, organizations are going to cherish it. And one of the battles I've been having for a number of years is to encourage people to see face-to-face as the most valuable communication channel there is. I think people are going to value it and try and squeeze more value out of it in the future. That's it. I hope I haven't gone over my time by too much. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you, Dominic. That was great. I was particularly pleased to hear about the kind of death of formality, as somebody who is the most informal communicator ever. So that's kind of music to my ears. I'm going to pass over to Sue now. Sue's going to give some insight into leading HR teams based on her own recent and timely experience. So over to you, Sue.
Thank you. And thank you to Dominic. I'd like to think that I do those 7 things. But I'm going to go and ask my team and check that out, because that's a fantastic list and absolutely real in this moment. In the interest of storytelling, I'm just going to tell you a little bit of a story about my landing in West Sussex County Council. The last 3 years, I spent time doing short-term interim projects, and I was invited to go to West Sussex to fill in a gap as they wait for a new permanent appointment. And of course I landed, and then COVID-19 landed immediately after me. So there's an immediate challenge there of I'm a very sociable person. I like to think that there's a human in my human resource interaction and endeavour. And of course I'm denied that because I can't see the people that I work with and actually haven't met quite a few of them. So it's a big thing, this whole communication and leading through a crisis, which really you're doing at a remove. And where normally we would have face-to-face conversations, you get all the verbal cues that are around you, you clearly don't get that. So you have to work harder at this communication stuff. And I think Dominic's absolutely spot on with, this is a very human and empathetic environment where I'm trying to understand what every individual is going through within your team at this stage. because everybody's circumstances are different. I think we've been bombarded in the last few weeks with people trying to tell us how to get more from our remote teams, how to manage our remote teams better, how to increase productivity. I'm less interested in that, I think, than in trying to make sure that I look after my team. The response from local government, the response from the public sector through this crisis has been absolutely phenomenal. I am so proud of the way that my team have stepped up and stepped in to new and different roles. We ask something new of our team every day, whether that's to step out and stop doing what they're doing and go and lead a community hub, whether it's to set up a new set of processes. We've set up a redeployment hub, we're working with volunteers, we're working with partners, we're solving problems. So this is a whole new set of ways of applying those existing skills within HR. And my goodness, are they skilled and are they talented? So being able to recognize that in this context is great. It's a great opportunity for us to say to our teams, do you know what? You really are very good at what you do, but you're now using those skills in a slightly different way. We've never been more connected. I think we're digitally hyperactive. I don't know about you, but I find that I struggle now to switch off. My phone is in my hand all the time. I kind of feel like I'm tied to this because we're in a crisis and we need to be there and we need to be able to answer questions. Now that has a knock-on effect on people's resilience and mental health. So we spent a lot of time, and I spent a lot of time, encouraging the organisation to think about how it looks after its mental and physical well-being through this, and trying to encourage people not to be afraid to switch off, not be afraid to log off and not be logged in the whole time, and actually thinking about recharging batteries. So a lot of reminders there, and HR I think have again a very really important role in looking after the organisation and reminding people that these are human beings in this, and we can't run at full tilt all of the time. This is a long haul emergency. It's not going away anytime soon. So this pace we have to maintain and we have to sustain. And in terms of that sustenance, it's about, I think, allowing for understanding of people's individual circumstances. So for two parents trying to work from home and homeschool and juggle childcare, that's a real tall order. So giving them advice about being more productive isn't going to go anywhere. It's more important for them that you understand and can empathise with the situation where they might have a 4-year-old running around while they're trying to write a policy or they're trying to do some work. And I think people feel less productive because they feel that there are too many distractions. And let's be really, really clear that actually people are not working from home, they're working at home. And that's different. So there are times when people choose to work from home. Chances are your children are in school, there's peace and quiet, and you use that time to get on. This is not the case now. We've got people whose home lives and working lives have completely conflated. And so communicating in that environment is about understanding where they are, understanding what their challenges are, and giving them permission to find that tough, as we find it tough. And I think that there's something about HR leading the way and role modeling that kind of empathetic approach, which says, let's look after this organisation. At the end of the day, I want to come out of this with the staff in West Sussex saying, actually, we worked well in looking after them. We did it right. We didn't get it right all the time, but we really had our hearts in the right place in terms of managing people through this particular crisis. And I think that for us, that has meant working very closely with the communications team. So the regular big messages go out, the regular exchanges. The chief exec and I ran a webinar last week, a live chat, dealing with people's questions and concerns. So there is a channel for people to say, I'm worried about that, or have we thought about this? Recognizing that that feedback loop is so important. Yes, well done, you got that right. How can we do that? And also, I think HR is in a really important position here in terms of storing up the organizational learning. we are learning so much at the moment about how the organisation can be different going forward, that means that we can really take into the future those things that are right, those things that work, those things that will drive a better place to work, give us a much better feel for how well people can contribute and where their strengths are, and recognising that adaptability. And that's my favourite word at the moment, adaptability. And if you want adaptability, you needn't look much further than your HR teams. And I think I've been very fortunate. I've come into West Sussex straight into the strategic leadership team, which means that HR has that voice at the senior table. We're in at the beginning of the decision making, and we're able to influence the people agenda really positively and allow us to think about how's that going to impact on our staff, what do people need to know, how can we best communicate with people, how can we best get these messages across. And one of the things that I think has stood out for me is that willingness of people to really make a change in their behaviour. It comes back to one of Dominic's points. Actually, I've had to change the way I do things. I've had to change the way I think. And so have our staff. And they really, really have. And I think, again, it's that working out just how we will capitalise on that flexibility going forward. And I think that for us, the public sector have had a Herculean task, really, in terms of supporting the NHS, particularly local government, have supported the NHS in keeping people out of hospitals. Now, that's brought with it a whole raft of other issues, and we're learning how we can respond very quickly, how we can solve problems very quickly. But that organisational learning, if we're not careful, we might lose that as we go back to the new normal. And also now we're starting to have very detailed conversations around what the post-lockdown world might look like and what the world of work might look like going forward. So starting to communicate with people about how we might come out of this, what things we want to take forward, what we want to leave behind, what our objectives are, where our values will sit. And my goodness, we've really challenged ourselves. One of the other things that I think has been fantastically sort of comes to the fore is that idea of trust in an organisation. You know, in the past, I have worked in organisations trying to move forward around agile and flexible working. The root of that is in trust. And I have had conversations in the past with managers who say, well, have you appointed people that you can't trust to work at home? Well, now we've had to, and now we will going forward. So there's a big change here, I think, in terms of how we think about work, how we think about what's meaningful. And one thing that I think is coming back in spades is the fact that people have felt really engaged and involved in solving those issues within their communities. And that real sense of connection that we in HR have now in solving problems in the real world. So we are not in the background, we're at the forefront, we're right at the beginning of this. And actually that's a really important place to be, and not losing that, and not really recognising what that should do for our confidence as a profession and for the way in which we think about our contribution to organisations going forward. So when we write our people strategies, when we're working on our policies, let's keep this learning in view. Let's recognise just what this crisis has meant for us and where that's taken us, A, as a profession, and B, as individuals, because I think in those two parallels, there's an awful lot there for us to take forward and to be able to use. I think finally, from me, working in an organisation where you know that there's a broad range of things that have to be delivered, becoming part of that, being part of the overall machine that produces big solutions for communities and addresses very major issues in our local areas, it means that we need to step up into that space. And I am, as I say, so proud of the way that my team have done that. And I think there's a whole raft of new respect there across every team within our organisation. And again, HR have a role to make sure that we don't lose that and we're able to capitalise on it going forward. So let's think about that in terms of what it means for role profiles. Let's think about that for what it means for managing performance, for making sure people understand and get good feedback around what they've contributed and how they can recognise those new skills and take them forward and use them more wisely. So it's been a really interesting ride for me the last few weeks to pitch up in an organisation. We've at the same time, we have inducted 2 directors into the organisation who've never met. One of them has never set foot inside the building, and of course is leading and running a major service at the heart of this crisis. And we've had to work very hard with them to kind of help them overcome those challenges whilst maintaining social distancing, not wanting them to go and sort of get involved and get stuck in at the front line. It's very hard for leaders to take that step and to lead from a virtual position. And finally, I think there's something in there about really seeing things differently and doing things differently and not being surprised by the learning that you get from this, and not being surprised by thinking, actually, that doesn't work, maybe I'll try something different, and being able to open up about who you are within that process. So I've tried to write to my team on a regular basis. I like to try to check in, not check up, open up the lines of communication, drop into those kinds of meetings and actually have those regular meetings with my team. We're probably more connected than we have been. And that's good, and let's keep that going forward. But it will never, ever, ever replace that lovely feeling of walk into an office and see people and engage with people on a human level, because that's what we're all about, really. And that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Sue. That was brilliant to hear, and I think we'll come into the discussion later about how to capture some of the learnings and what a interesting and I guess almost game-changing moment this has been for the profession. I'm going to hand over to David now to talk about leadership communication within a global business. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you for the opportunity to be joining you today. So just to give you a little bit of context around Total Produce, we are a global fresh produce company. We have almost 40,000 people working at over 270 sites from South America, North America, and across Europe, with a joint venture business also in India. So we are in the business of growing product, sourcing product, and then supplying it into retailers, wholesale and through food service. So when you think about fresh produce from our point of view, it's any vegetable product, fruit product, or salad product. The last few weeks, you can imagine just personally what that's been like for us, because we describe it as 3 or 4 Christmases in one go. We normally would see peaks of demand by 50% at Christmas time, and we would be planning a few months ahead for that. That all happened incredibly quickly, and we had several weeks of that sort of level of demand, although that is now beginning to reduce to more normal levels. So that has put enormous challenges into the organisation. So on one hand, we've had a big peak in demand, but then of course, where we've been supplying restaurants and the catering sector, that has dropped off to almost zero. So we've had to cope with managing those changes as well in the market. So lots of change to manage very quickly. Now, we already work in a very remote, decentralized way within the business. So we have regional structures, we have regional CEOs looking after businesses in different parts of the world. The group CEO himself, he lives in Spain, I'm based in the UK, the FD is based in Ireland. So it gives you a bit of an idea of, we were already working in that sort of way. Although it did, whilst we have lots of calls and video conferences, just before the lockdown took place, I was having a conversation with our CEO about having a really good day on succession planning, and he said, David, we just could do with a day just going walking on the beach and getting ourselves really thinking about this quite deeply. Wouldn't that be great to do that? And then, of course, that was stopped. So we're having to do that now virtually. So maybe we'll figure out how to do a beach session virtually. But it was the idea of being together, and now we're having to do it quite differently. So here now we're thinking about how do we manage communication across this incredibly diverse organisation, which is decentralised, but we need to make sure that we send out the right messages from the group. So very much at the beginning of the lockdown, we started working in quite a different way, in a much more disciplined way around staying in touch with the business. So every week now I have a call with our CEO, with another member of the executive team. During the week, we make sure we stay in really close contact with all of our senior executives and senior management. So during the week, we're making regular calls and just finding out how people are and what's happening in the business. And then we debrief the CEO, who's also doing the same thing, I should say, on a Monday morning. And then we decide what communication is important for that week. So it's just really making sure we're keeping very close contact with what's happening around the organisation. At the beginning of the lockdown period, bearing in mind, of course, that was being phased across different parts of the world at different times, but very early into the lockdown in Europe, the CEO sent out quite a detailed communication to the whole group, which was cascaded to all employees. The way we structured that was very much a top-level message. So the top-level message was, we are in a critical industry, we're very busy, please don't worry about the organisation for the longer term, albeit we're going to have to make a lot of changes very, very quickly to cope with the demand or to cope with the reduction in different parts of the organisation. So one top-level message with just some sub-points, just to explain to people that we knew what was going on within the business and we were giving some really important context around what was happening in different parts of the world. Other, I guess, bits of advice I would share on this, it's very important, I think, in that type of communication that the CEO recognises specific things that are happening in the business to demonstrate that the CEO is in touch. So, for example, when the CEO was thanking people for working safely, he then cited examples of what he knew was going on within the business to demonstrate that. So it's making it very tangible for people that the CEO does understand what's actually happening. So one of the questions I think for any CEO or senior leader is, what are your eyes and ears? How are you really making sure you know what's happening in your organisation, particularly if it's very diverse and very spread around? That's very important. And then with quite a lot of supporting information as well to really make sure that when we're talking about the business being safe for the longer term, well, what does that mean? And how can we really demonstrate that? So we were talking about the fact, we are in a sector where people do need to eat. We are providing healthy food. So it's a sector that is important for the longer term, albeit it might change shape or it might be under a lot of pressure. It is going to be important for the longer term. So really trying to reduce some of the fear people might feel at this time. But at a group level, we found a really useful approach by bringing together HR representatives from each of our key businesses across the globe and having video conference events with them to really find out what's happening within the organisation. So we're sharing practices around how are they communicating locally within their businesses, how will they handle safe working, so what does that look like for them in their particular part of the business. What about remote working? How is remote working happening? And what are they learning? What are we all learning from that in different parts of the group? So from doing that, we then pulled together information packs that we shared across the group so people can look at what's happening in different areas and learn from the good practices and the experiences that are happening across the group. I thought one of the most lovely examples was a CEO of one of our businesses in North America, where they, in that particular business, employ 300 people. He's based at home at the moment as the CEO, but he's making around 150 calls a week to cross-section of people right across the business, from forklift drivers who are still working in the warehouse, delivery drivers who are still delivering to our customers, sales teams that are working from home. And when I just got into a little bit of detail around, so how are you handling those calls? What are you discussing? He said, well, I'm just asking questions, really. That's the purpose of the call. How are you doing? How are you feeling at the moment? What concerns have you got? He said, a delivery driver at the moment going out to deliver into a retailer is actually can be quite worried because they are feeling more exposed than somebody who's working from home. So listening to that and then giving reassurance and actually feeding back then to that individual's line manager what they're hearing so that the line managers can be, again, getting another insight from the CEO. But I just thought it was a lovely example of the CEO really, really keeping in touch with the whole organisation and being very open. And then, of course, it would then give him the opportunity to talk about the wider business. So just imagine if you're driving a forklift and the CEO calls you and you're getting a little update in terms of what's happening within the business itself as well. Very, very simple, but very, very powerful, I think. We're also seeing examples where daily team briefings are happening very well across the organisation. So we've got examples of a dozen or 15 people coming onto a call at 8:30 with a video call, just to get the day going, and they're running the team brief just in the same way they would do in the office. So people have to be up, they have to be dressed, they have to be ready, and then they will have that regular daily check-in, and that's a pattern that we're seeing across the group that's been very effective, I think. And then on the more informal side of it, we've had lovely examples where some teams are having evening cocktail gatherings and having a glass of wine or a cocktail with each other and just chatting about family and the informal things as well. And some lovely examples of that happening, which was very, very human, very down to earth, and again, very practical. So I think the other point that I think Dominic particularly was picking up on this is at the moment, you know, we've learned it's very important that we keep everything in terms of communication at a group level very down to earth. We're being very open. We're not using a lot of platitudes. You know, people don't want to have, I think, leadership speeches, you know, that try and help change their views or opinions of the world. Let's just recognise that we are going through a very challenging time. It's more about asking the questions and listening to what people have to say, and then demonstrating that we are taking steps where we can to help people be safe within the business. So I think that's particularly critical. I think going forward, as a business, we demonstrate all those sorts of behaviours around, we could do with a 2-hour meeting, and we'll fly for a whole day just to have a 2-hour meeting, or we'll take a train journey and have a whole day out just for a 2-hour meeting. And the number of colleagues that are saying to me, you know, that's not really that smart, is it? You know, why are we spending all that time and all that money doing that? What we're doing now is working really well. So yes, we do need the face-to-face interaction. If we're going to have a strategy day, or we want a day where we can really get into some detail, then that face-to-face contact is still important. But this is working really well. And by the way, it's making a huge difference to our operating costs as well. And it also fits in with our sustainability strategy of running a business that is healthier for the planet as well. So I think one of the big changes we're going to see is definitely an automatic question people will ask when they've got to arrange a meeting is, can we do this virtually, before we decide we're going to book a flight. Definitely going to change. We've also noticed that the quality of conversations during video conferences can be incredibly high. And one of the reasons is that people have to give each other space so they can speak. You can't interrupt quite so well on a video conference, so you have to listen. And then the questions seem to be flowing very well. So people are now starting to realize that those coaching skills that they learned when they went on that coaching course a few years ago or a few months ago actually are really, really useful. So I think better listening, better communication is something that we're seeing coming out of it. And maybe another point to make here is that in terms of longer term changes, already where we're running leadership development programs, where we would have brought people together into a physical location and flown people to an international development event to come and meet in London perhaps, and we'd have flown people from Brazil or Canada, we're now saying, well, actually, we're starting to run these virtually, these events now, and they're working really well. So I think there'll be a change of approach to how we develop leadership capability going forward. And those sorts of events, I think we'll run more of them online and using this sort of technology than perhaps we would have done in the past. We won't completely replace it, but I think it will certainly change. So they're just some of the things that I feel I can share with you in these few minutes that we've got. I hope that's useful. I think summary for me is this has just been a time of being really in touch with the business, really in touch with each other, keeping everything very practical, keeping the language very simple and very straightforward. And I love that point about people just being themselves and being very honest. And I think we're having more honest conversations with people. People are being more straightforward than they ever have been. So I think there'll be a lot of positives come from that as we come out of this period. And I think also, I have to say, Katie, this event and these sorts of events that you're running and facilitating really are symptomatic, I think, of how we're changing our communication as a profession as well. And I think that bodes incredibly well for the future. Thank you, David. I'm going to got about 10 minutes to take some questions. Can I ask everyone to unmute themselves? So first one I'm going to take is one about, so we talked about the direction of travel towards kind of less formality and hierarchy, but sometimes crisis management requires quick responses and communication, so being a little bit more command and control. How do we square this with a more collegiate and consultative culture? And Dominic, I'll put that to you first, because you mentioned this kind of more less formal kind of form of leadership.
Okay, I think two things. One is helping managers be intentional in the way that or leaders be intentional in the way they communicate what they're doing. So I guess being more situational in what they're doing, recognizing the time for direction and the time for support. I think the other thing is being clear on why you're doing stuff. So if you have to make quick decisions, explain why they have to be quick and why you have to get there and why it's that way. And then perhaps the third thing to add is when you've done it, have time to go back and see how you could do those sort of things differently and involve people in helping you shape that.
Anyone else want to?
May I add, I'm ex-army, so you would expect me to put in a vote here for command and control. I think sometimes we confuse command and control with micromanagement. And the one thing we haven't been able to do in this situation is micromanage, so we have had to trust people to get on with stuff. Good command and control allows us to set the direction of travel, let people understand what the issue is, and then set them free to go and find the solutions. And that's exactly what we've seen. And it's great to trust people and empower them, and then they can collaborate with whoever they need to get things done. And we've seen that happen too.
Thank you. Somebody's asked, do you believe this situation will improve HR's credibility within organisations? David, Peter, any views on that?
Yeah, maybe kick off with that one, Casey. I think it will, and I think it must. I mean, we've all acknowledged on this call that HR is very much at the centre of so much of this debate, all the way from just the operational stuff we've had to manage with very quickly adapting to remote working, how we connect people, internal comms, well-being. I mean, these are all big HR themes, and I think it is a time for us to connect in these ways so that we can all gain strength from each other, because I think on the slightly downside, if you will, is the profession is under a great deal of pressure. It's under a great deal of scrutiny. We talked a lot about leaders being under scrutiny, but I think HR is as well. And this is the time for us to connect. And I'm absolutely sure, and I think it's a very important part of so much of the communications in any way, shape, or form, that we talk about the positives of all of this. And I think one of the positives really should be that HR is stronger, it's more positioned at the heart of business thinking, because the heart of business thinking is shifting to be much more humanitarian, if you will, people at the very heart of business. And this whole idea of what stewardship is, which is, you have to steward a business financially, but your two big things you have in any organization are money and people. And people make up most of the costs. So if we don't better understand this stuff and how best to get the more out of our people, particularly in these circumstances, then we will have missed an opportunity. But as I said, I really, really believe this will signal a significant shift in where HR is positioned within organizations.
And David, do you agree from a practitioner perspective within your?
I do, Katie. Just a couple of perspectives, I think, here. I think, first of all, this situation has inevitably forced HR into the spotlight because we've had to step in and actually do our job, which is to advise the business in terms of how to manage the situation from a people point of view, to understand the legalities and the policies and processes that need to be put into place. So I think, in a sense, it has projected us, but it's actually been because we're doing what we need to do in the organisation, if that makes sense. I think the opportunity from here is that many organisations are having to look at their organisation design. They're thinking about how they're going to operate strategically going forward. And we'll have seen a lot about how we've responded in a crisis as an organisation. So how have our leaders behaved? How has the business performed and operated from a people and organisational perspective? And there will be, no doubt, a good amount of work to do as a result of all of that learning and that experience. So it's now important that HR takes that and starts to influence the strategy of the organisation and make recommendations for what needs to happen in the future. So I think that's the opportunity. So I think it is a very exciting time as well.
Thank you. Sue, somebody's asked if you'd expand on what you hope organisations will take forward post-lockdown. So what learning that you mentioned that you hope that the organisation won't lose?
Yes, hello Rachel, I saw your question. I think we want to hang on to those real lessons around adaptability, being able to take our skills and transfer them and apply our skills and talents differently and more broadly across the business. I think that's what needs to go forward. I think also our lessons around agile and flexible working and our ability to step up and solve different problems. I think the things we want to lose are some of that hierarchical, rather stiff and clunky policies things that slow us down and things that don't allow us to take those decisions in peacetime, as it were, more quickly and in a more agile way.
Thank you. Somebody's asked about resilience and the importance of resilience to kind of the whole organisation and taking a whole company approach to resilience. Is that something that anyone can chat about, what they've been doing in their organisation to kind of boost that, and how the importance of resilient leadership?
Yeah, I think so. Our health and safety teams and our public health teams have been working very hard to really help people to become much more resilient, thinking about your mental health, your physical health and well-being, constant reminders of that, whole organisation reminders that this is something that we have to sustain. So yes, I think it's a really important thing, and I wouldn't want to gloss over it. It's been absolutely writ large over our response all the way through, about resilient communities and resilient organisations.
Yeah, Katie, it's probably worth mentioning through our research, we've done quite a lot on resilience, particularly through the crisis. And as you said, Sue, at these different levels, individual resilience, organizational resilience. So there's some good stuff that we'll be posting very shortly on the outcome of that research, but it emphasizes those points. And let's not forget, in the individual resilience, that the resilience of leaders is really crucial. And we do need to pay attention to our own and individual well-being. It's so often the case that leaders want to present that strong image all the time, but we're vulnerable as well, as we said, and so part of resilience is recognizing where you are vulnerable and being honest about it. And yeah, we've seen it all the way up to Boris Johnson's had to deal with it personally as well. So you're right, individual and collective and organizational resilience are all part of this bigger debate that's emerging.
Brilliant. A question on the tech. Somebody using Teams broadcasts for the executive board to give updates and take Q&A. David, what are you using as an organisation to kind of get those broadcasts across? And maybe Dominic, what are you seeing people using and working quite well?
Yeah. Microsoft Teams seems to be the favoured technology for our business. I think people have been using Zoom. Then a few concerns came up around security. I think it depends on what you're using it for, but I think perhaps for more sensitive meetings, Teams seems to be the go-to. But I've seen people using WhatsApp video calls, and they just seem to be dipping into what works for them. But Skype, less popular perhaps than it was in our business. So that's the quick answer, Katie.
And Dominic, when you're doing kind of big broadcasts, maybe company-wide, have you got any quick tips on making the tech work for you rather than against you? It sometimes can feel.
I'm not really a great technician, but what I think is having an open conversation about it. So if things are not working, if things are going down, if people are having problems with their IT, creating an environment in which they can just say that. I think that makes the whole conversation much more productive and effective. But like David, and we're seeing it, most people using Teams, a bit of Zoom. Zoom seems to have petered off a little bit now, but mostly Teams. But I think it's about the way that you do it and having that conversation about it.
And this is quite a big question, but I'm just going to ask it quickly, and maybe one or two people give a quick response. How do we think COVID-19 will affect HR and leadership and communication after we get back to whatever normal looks like? So, Peter, what do you think the kind of long-term impact might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we've already explored on this call, lots of things, whether it be flexible working, that we will understand we can work in these more agile ways. And I think, as you said, Sue, the very heart of that idea is the idea of trust. Because if we're honest, why have we made such little progress on things like flexible working? It's because we haven't trusted people in these circumstances. So trust is, I think, one of the big outcomes of all of this. I think it will drive also some different ways in which we understand each other individually. So the collective cultures that come out of this, I think, can be positively reinforced. And as I said in my opening remarks, our values can be really, really reinforced. The flip side to these things, if we're not making the right calls or decisions, some of these things can be damaged. But I think those are very positive outcomes as examples that we should be looking for.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this afternoon. So I'd like to thank our panel so much for giving up their time and for sharing their stories and tips so openly. This webinar will be available on demand from this afternoon. So feel free to watch it again if you like, or share it with peers and colleagues. As Peter mentioned, also I'd like to recommend an excellent piece coming out from CIPD's Head of Research and Thought Leadership, Ed Houghton, on leadership in crisis and organisational resilience, which is going to be published tomorrow. That's going to be well worth a read. And just quickly to flag our next couple of webinars, on Friday, we're going to be exploring how HR teams can look after their own well-being. And we know how hard all of you are working. And next Monday, we'll be talking about line managers, supporting them during this crisis and beyond. A reminder to keep using the CIPD Coronavirus Hub for resources, the CIPD communities for support, and if you remember, the HR Inform helpline for individual responses to your toughest questions. So that's all from us for this afternoon. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you.